Right. So it's quite a global performance today with four speakers, and I'll just very briefly introduce the four of them. So first of all, Tomoko Wakabayashi is a project coordinator and specially appointed professor at Rikkyo University. She was previously at the Association for Corporate Support of the Arts in Japan. And since 2013, she's been freelance in a wide variety of roles supporting arts and cultural activities around Japan. Then our second speaker is Dr. Justin Jesty. He's associate professor at the Department of Asian Languages and Literature, the University of Washington in Seattle. And his research focuses on the relationship between art and social movements in Japan. And he fairly recently published a prize-winning book, Art and Engagement in Early Post-War Japan. And then we have two speakers representing the new organization Art for All. First of all, Joy Kawakubo is an artist based in London and Tokyo. He's had a number of important exhibitions, of which I think the most important isn't mentioned here, but it was held at the Daiwa Foundation in 2016. And he's also a fellow of the Overseas Study Program for Artists run by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs. And then Takaya is another artist who is involved with this new organization, Art for All. She is a painter who graduated from Goldsmiths in London in 2016. And she is a personality on AFA radio, where she interviews various people involved in the arts industry.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Tomoko Wakabayashi. I live in Tokyo, but I'm joining you online today from Japan's southern island of Okinawa, which I'm visiting at the moment. I'm very honored to be able to take I'm very honored to be able to take part in this talk session today. I'd like to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation and Art for All for giving me this opportunity. Also, I'm not good at English, so I'm grateful for the translation and interpretation support I have received. The theme of today's talk is Art Ecology, Japan. My understanding is that we will use this time today to consider the arts and cultural ecosystem in Japan. I'd like to talk about the Japanese overall arts and culture ecosystem seen from the perspective of support environment for arts and culture. Okay, next, please. The theme of today, from 1999, I worked for 15 years as a program officer at the Association for Corporate Support of the Arts, a not-for-profit organization promoting cultural activities by business corporations. It's a similar organization to Arts and Business in the UK or Admicale in France. Currently, I work as an independent coordinator supporting arts organization, artists, and local government. So I'd like to talk about these 4 points today based on these experiences. First, I'd like to talk about the special features of Japanese support for the arts and culture. In Japan, there is a long history of proactive support for culture, not just from the privileged and ruling classes, but also from the ordinary people. For example, in the Edo period, townspeople were active participants and supporters of culture, and traders in riverside fish markets patronaged kabuki. Then, after Meiji restoration in the late 19th century, it was business people and corporations who sustained culture in the regions. The legacy of this private sector support of culture continues today. It's no exaggeration to say that Japanese business companies are the most generous supporters of culture in the world. There were two major interruptions of revolutions in Japanese culture in the form of the Meiji Restoration and Second World War, but the general ecosystem in which culture and the arts have flourished through support from the private sector hasn't changed for a long time. Okay, next slide, please. When it comes to public sector cultural policies, it's been local governments across the country rather than the national government that have taken the lead. Having said that, after World War II, the national government dropped its wartime policy of cultural control and political exploitation of the arts, set some distance between itself and art practitioners, and took a cautious approach with regard to cultural policy. The Agency of Cultural Affairs, Bunkacho, was not created until 1968. And it was only 20 years ago, in 2001, that the government first explicitly took on the duty to promote culture with the enactment of the Basic Act for the promotion of culture and the arts. Next, please. Next slide, please. The result has been the formation of a support environment for the arts and culture in Japan that is well balanced between the national government, local governments, and the private sector, i.e. Business corporations and individuals. The Japanese model is neither state-led, local government-led, nor private sector donation-led. But this also means that none of three takes the clear leadership role. The trend in recent years has been for those involved in the arts and culture across all artistic genres to ask increasingly for various forms of support from the national government. Many people are calling for increases in the national budget for culture, the establishment of the cultural ministry, not agency, and grants giving. And I have the impression that they are becoming increasingly dependent. For a long time after the war, artists themselves were wary of national cultural policies, but now I feel that we are starting to see major change in the Japanese cultural ecosystem as regards the relationship between artists and the state. Okay, next slide, please. Next, I will give an overview of art support during the three difficult situations, by which I mean recessions, natural disasters, and COVID-19. First, how have things been during recessions? According to fact-finding research carried out by the Association for Corporate Support of the Arts, art support as part of their corporate social responsibility showed no major decline, either in volume or total monetary value, either after the bursting of the economic bubble in 1991 or at the time of Lehman shock in 2008. What showed a decline was spending on cultural support out of advertising budgets. Rather than recessions, the factor that's caused a major change in the ecosystem for corporate art support over the last 20 years has been more a matter of broadening social issues. As a result of the increasing diversity and complexity of social issues, there has been an acceleration of interest in and support for sectors other than the arts. As for the national cultural budget, it hasn't decreased during recessions, and it doubled over the 30 years from 1991, when it was 53.9 billion yen. It's been over 100 billion yen since 2003. And up to the current fiscal year, it's continued to increase slightly every year, driven by the cultural program for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. By contrast, local governments have been struggling with declining tax revenues amidst long-term economic stagnation and declining populations. So their cultural budget peaked at 955 billion yen in 1993 after the bursting of the bubble and have been declining for 30 years. They can't avoid conservation costs for cultural assets and running costs for cultural facilities. So these expenditure have continued, but softer parts of the budget, such as spending on cultural activities, grants, and collecting artworks, are in crisis. Okay, next slide, please. Let's turn to cultural support after natural disasters. Following the Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake in 1995, citizens and corporations took the initiative in making contributions and engaging in charitable art activities. At the time of the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011, artists, arts organizations, citizens, and companies quickly responded by offering financial support and also carried out arts activities aimed at providing emotional support for the region. The national government quickly sent out specialists to save and repair cultural assets. And although it lagged behind, the private sector also established financial contribution programs. Japan has a lot of earthquake and natural disasters, and I think it's fair to say that as a result of these two experiences, there is high awareness of the need to maintain the cultural system, ecosystem, when natural disasters strike. But at times of natural disaster, the safety net for individual artists and for regional cultural resources that aren't registered cultural assets is full of holes. When it comes to COVID-19, the public quickly rallied around with crowdfunding and other forms of contribution and support for people in need in the arts sector and for cultural facilities. There was also a prompt response from local governments across the country who established emergency arts grant systems, but the majority of these were not straightforward benefits, but were grants for carrying out work such that no grants were available unless deliverables were produced, which put artists in a difficult situation, difficult position if they needed money upfront. At the national level, the Agency for Cultural Affairs was slow both to make a statement and to come up with practical support policies. In both fiscal 2020 and fiscal 2021, it provided result-based support for artists and art organizations in the form of 90 billion yen supplementary budget. But there was a great deal of confusion about the process by which these funds were allocated, so they cannot really be said to be constituted a safety net. The government established a system through which there were preferential tax treatment for people who choose not to take refund of tickets for canceled performances, but to donate the money instead. But this was a cultural policy that faced many obstacles that could only be overcome in the context of major emergency. Okay, next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about the COVID special grants for contemporary art by the Toshiaki Ogasawara Memorial Foundation, a program I was involved in setting up. This foundation was established with the private funds of Toshiaki Ogasawara, the founder of NIFCO, a manufacturer of industrial fasteners and other precision products. Originally, it worked to support science and technology, but it started a contemporary art division in 2020, the year that COVID-19 arrived. As a result of research it carried out with those involved in the contemporary art sector into what was needed, it established an emergency grant program with no restrictions on how the money was to be spent. In the first year, 5.3 million yen was given out to 104 people. The recipients were not limited to artists or creators, but included a wide range of professionals such as curators, installers, administrators, and researchers. And grants were particularly focused on individuals and freelancers. The intention was to prevent the collapse of the cultural ecosystem. From the application form we received, we could see the serious problem by those on the front line of the arts, including declines in income resulting from the cancellation or postponement of projects, payment not being made for completed works, and the absence of contracts. We felt strongly the fragility of the safety net, protecting not only those in the contemporary visual arts field, but those involved in the arts and culture more generally. In the second year, fiscal 2020, we selected grant recipient for a similar sum of money. The second time round, we paid particular attention to the safety net and included contributions to forming the contemporary art ecosystem among the assessment criteria. The foundation defined the contemporary art ecosystem as not limited to the creative activities of artists, but including the underlying foundations that organically generate the whole circle of contemporary art, including those who create, exchange, support, and transmit the arts among diverse communities. In assessing the application, we stressed, for example, the support of NPOs and arts project playing an intermediary support role, forming the regional contemporary arts and cultural ecosystem outside major cities. The reason for this was that if the organizations collapse as a result of COVID, the cultural ecosystem in the regions would collapse at the stroke. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I'd like to talk about my fourth and last topic today, the current situation of arts and cultural ecosystem in Japan. I'd like to reiterate that I'm defining the arts and cultural ecosystem as the whole system of everybody and everything involved in arts and culture, as well as the environment that they organically link together and circle in, giving rise to creations, the reception of these creations, and support activities. Creation, reception, and support are the equivalent of birth, consumption, and deconsumption in the biological ecosystem. So to conclude my talk today, I'd like to give an overview of the current situation of Japan's arts and cultural ecosystem. First, as regards creation, I think I could say that the overall environment is pretty good by global standards. Japan has a thriving scene of people taking part in cultural activities and activities by hobbyists and amateurs. But the creative and expressive environment for professional artists, as well as the employment environment for arts professionals, is not fully developed. Many of those who graduate from the art university unable to make a living, and there are relatively few employment opportunities in cultural organizations. So there is inadequate circulation in the ecosystem. Corporations and campaigning activities among those involved in creative activities are also undeveloped. So I think it's very important that Art for All has raised its voice and started its initiative to get us to work together to improve the creation environment. Next comes the environment for receiving arts and culture. And overall, I think this is in good shape too. By global standards, Japan has an unparalleled number and variety of cultural institutions right across the country, large numbers of artistic and cultural projects, and plentiful opportunities to experience culture and the arts, both in school education and in lifelong learning sector. Many highly distinctive regional cultural traditions are maintained, but there are regional disparities in access to culture, low consideration of cultural rights, that right for everybody, including weaker members of society, to experience culture is also an issue. Finally, as regards support, as I have already said, there is a good balance of cultural support between the public and private sectors, but there is no obvious leadership and there is no clear philosophy underlying cultural support policies. Both the public and private sector are weak at creating structures, systematizing, appealing to society at large to raise consciousness of the needed for support and campaigning activities. The layer of the intermediate support organizations who fulfill an important function in the cultural ecosystem is thin, and there is a tremendous shortage of people playing linking roles. In Japan and in Japanese society, understanding and respect for the arts and people involved in the arts is weak, and when the arts are compared with other sectors of society, they always end up being regarded as low priority. That concludes my talk about the Japanese arts and cultural ecosystem, seen from the perspective of the support environment for the arts and culture to face the issues that exist at the moment and to create a favorable cultural ecosystem, I strongly feel that we need an organization like Art for All that Joy-san and Towa-san are going to have a presentation later. I will finish there. Thank you so much indeed.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Tomoko-san. Okay, I'll move straight on without further ado to our second speaker, Dr. Justin Jesty.
Hi, everyone. So let me get my PowerPoint. Is everything working? I'm unmuted. Okay, great.
Yeah, it seems to be, yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'm also really looking forward to hearing about Art for All. My talk is going to, is similar to Wakabayashi-san's talk, in the question that I'm interested in is that of how artists and their work can be sustained, how artists can secure a livelihood for themselves, how can their work be supported in production, exhibition, how can their rights be protected, particularly the right to free expression. And I want to look at these questions from the perspective of artists themselves and to see how they've organized to support their work across the 20th century. So I'm looking at a kind of broad time period. And that's going to be most of my talk. Right at the end, I want to comment on the question, another question of the panel, which is that of how modern and contemporary art responds to crisis. But that's just going to be a comment at the end. The first step I need to take is to define who and what we're talking about when we use the term art and artist. And I'm sort of coming from visual arts or art history background. So I think most people here know that the ideas and practices and institutions of fine art or bijutsu were established during the Meiji period as part of Japan's nation building project. But the 19th century European idea of fine art, that is basically oil painting and sculpture, is not a natural one. It's quite an arbitrary set of practices. So the project of building bijutsu in Japan involved reorganizing the field of visual and material arts that already existed in a way that split the field into several sectors, each with different economic, institutional, and ideological circumstances. One major split was between traditional and modern. So traditional expressive forms like ceramics and printmaking and calligraphy were lumped into the category of craft or koge, while fine art, painting, and sculpture were treated as a separate entity under the term bijutsu. Bijutsu was further split between Nihonga and Yoga, and then in the 1950s and 1960s, contemporary art becomes yet another art world, which again is quite separate institutionally and culturally from the others. And this is to say that historically there has never been a single art world in modern Japan, at least until recently. This might well be changing over the past 20 to 30 years. But up until recently, there are several art worlds that historically have very little crossover among them. And the reason I start out with this distinction is that I want to emphasize that among the different art worlds, the position of yoga, and after that, the position of Gendai Bijutsu has always been the most precarious economically. State support is lower when compared to state support for traditional arts, and there's very little market for yoga and contemporary art by Japanese artists. Painters and sculptors working in these new expressive forms in the early 20th century could not rely on audiences to be there for their work. They could not rely on patrons and collectors. They had to build much of the cultural and institutional context themselves. Reiko Tomi has done a lot of work to show how artist collectives responded to that challenge across the 20th century. So I'd like to spend a moment talking about what Tomi calls the Dantai model of collectivism that emerges in the early 20th century. Again, this kind of first half of the 20th century. The Dantai fulfilled a range of important functions. Their centerpiece was an annual exhibition, in particular, an open call exhibition, meaning that anyone could submit their work to the exhibition, and it would be held in Tokyo and then travel to regional cities. Anyone could submit an artwork to these exhibitions, and all of the submitted works would be considered by a panel of judges made up of senior members of the Dantai. And the works that the panel selected would be exhibited. But it wasn't only works by Dantai members that were exhibited every year. A portion of the exhibition included work by non-members. These exhibitions were extremely popular, and they played a leading role in popularizing modern art for a middle-brow audience. The judging of works created legibility in an unfamiliar field. Through research institutes, study groups, publications, the Dantai carried out a kind of ongoing educational role. Over the first half of the 20th century, art societies combined three art institutional roles: that of the critic, the dealer, and the curator. Kitazawa Noriaki has referred to the Dantai as shadow museums of modern art in Japan. And that's because there were no actual museums for modern art until after 1945. The Ohara Museum, founded in 1930, is the first museum of modern art in Japan, but it did not house works by Japanese artists. It was only in 1951, with the founding of the Kamakura Museum of Modern Art, that museums began to support the work of Japanese modern artists. So through these multiple roles, art societies became the primary institutions of cultural authority. It makes them perennial targets of criticism from artists who wanted to push the boundaries of expression. And indeed, the first open call society, the Nikkakai, came into existence when a group of painters split off from the state-sponsored Bunten salon to create a new separate section for artists with fresh approaches. So the name of the society itself, Nikkakai, means separate section or second section. And this was the first in a long process of splintering, in which artists rejected an established art society and went on to form their own group. And here are some of the larger Dantai that formed pre-war. But each time, the hierarchical structure was replicated in the new Dantai, setting the stage for further splits. Artists in the 1950s and 1960s usually shunned the Dantai for their conservatism. But on the other hand, it's through them that the Japanese public first encountered a wide variety of modern artistic styles. Unlike the structuring of modern art in the West, new styles did not displace older ones. So rather than the kind of scrap and build cycle of Western, modern, and contemporary art, the Dantai created a space for gradually expanding pluralism. After 1945, a separate art world begins to develop, one which would come to be called Gendai Bijutsu, or Gendai Ato, modern art, contemporary art. And there are many reasons for why and how Gendai Bijutsu emerged as a separate art world. In terms of macro scale shifts, Japan's alliance with the United States at a time when the center of the art world shifted from Paris to New York is a big factor. But alongside the many other reasons, I don't want to overlook how artists themselves addressed failings they saw in the aftermath of war and defeat. In fact, institutional reform was one of the primary ways that the modern art world critically reflected on the experience of war and fascism. On New Year's Day, 1946, artist Matsumoto Shinsuke wrote a famous letter to his colleagues. This is often cited in this context, and sent it to his colleagues around Japan, where he argued that the failures of the art world, the modern art world, lay in the factionalism and the lack of truly public space for debates and discussions about art. During the war, artists who refused to cooperate with the military were jailed and sometimes tortured. The military controlled access to oil paints and exhibition opportunities. And seeing how weak the Dantai were in the face of this pressure, Matsumoto urged his colleagues, mostly other artists, to join together to support each other by setting up a chain of permanent galleries and by organizing their own exhibitions. And he described a democratic system of governance that would avoid the hierarchies of patronage that he saw as plaguing the pre-war Dantai and leading to their sort of inward-looking nature and lack of relevance to society. So it was a call to unify in the wake of oppression. But the unity that Matsumoto imagined was not a unity based on identity. It wasn't defined by a style or a temperament, but an organization that ideally would support and protect the creative expression of anyone and everyone. Not all of Matsumoto's suggestions came to pass, but many of them did. Many new organizations and exhibitions appeared during the occupation. I've just listed several of the largest ones. The new independent exhibitions seem to embody the spirit of trying to find a more publicly engaged, institutional format for modern art most directly. So these are exhibitions, the independent exhibitions are exhibitions where there's no judging or selection of artworks at all. So anyone who submits their works would have it hung in the gallery during the exhibition. And although it wasn't really their explicit goal at the time of their founding, these independent exhibitions do become the main stages, one of the main stages where a new generation of boundary crossing experimental artists would take the spotlight in the late 50s and early 1960s. So they really were a crucial part of the new art world of contemporary art. In the art world of contemporary art, the functions of the Dantai that the Dantai brought together, critic, dealer, and curator, begin to operate on their own terms. The number of galleries slowly increases from the 1950s and into the 1960s, very slowly, I should emphasize. More museums are built to house the works of Japanese modern artists. New forms of art criticism develop in Bijutsu Techo and Bijutsu Hihyo. Technologies for photographic printing developed quickly in the 1950s that drives the increase of image-heavy magazines. And I think that makes performance art, for instance, more broadly accessible. Yet still, it's not until the 1980s that the contemporary art world in Japan might be seen as roughly parallel to that in Europe and the US. And that's an observation that I take from Sumitomo Fumihiko. Up until that time, up until the 1980s, it is again primarily through the collaboration with fellow artists that contemporary artists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s supported their work. In other words, artists' own collectivism remained a pivotal enabler of the production of art, and to a lesser extent than it had done previously to exhibition as well. This is something that Tomi chronicles in her book, Radicalism in the Wilderness. So a basic pattern remains consistent across the 20th century, that the social institutional structures of support for art and artists were built for the most part by artists themselves. In a recent article in the journal Field, Tomi makes the interesting argument that socially engaged art is a term that doesn't make much sense for Japanese modern and contemporary artists because art had always been social for them. The question of what their art meant and how it could find a place in society was always there, front and center, as a concrete problem. And I'm not sure if this is a consolation, but in terms of how modern and contemporary art have been supported in Japan, a large part of the answer comes down to artists' own efforts. So as someone who studied post-1945 art in some depth, that aspect of art's social existence in Japan makes it more interesting to me. It's more open to the world around it, more permeable and hybrid. Artists are outgoing and engaged with people around them, even if it's in a playful, irreverent mode. And along those lines, I just want to highlight recent work by two art historians who, in different ways, attend to the dynamism as well as struggle that emerges from the away from the institutional centers of an established art world. Nakajima Izumi critically rewrites post-war art history to recenter the work of female artists who have been excluded from it. Yamamoto Hiroki puts the question of artists' engagement with society and politics at the center of his history of contemporary art. But building one's own context of visibility, in addition to and at the same time as making one's own art, turns out to be a lot of work. It also exposes artists to social and political pressures more directly. Artists in Kobo Dantai really had no mechanism to protect themselves from the fascist state in the 1930s and 1940s. Artists were also exposed to harassment under the censorship regime of the US occupation post-1945. Akasegawa Genpei was convicted of currency imitation for his 1,000 yen note works in the late 1960s. Many artists over the decades have had to contend with arbitrary and oppressive enforcement of obscenity laws. Recently, during the controversy surrounding the Hyogen no Fujiyu exhibit, I was really inspired by how artists themselves organized to resist the assault on free expression from both government and right-wing extremists. Artists spoke out and altered their works in response to the repression. And I remember Takayama Akira's project, the J-Art Call Center, where Takayama and other artists and volunteers fielded complaints from people protesting the exhibition. And I remember on the one hand feeling, what a pure and simple and humane intervention. What an artist, what an artwork. But at the same time feeling equally dejected, like, why should artists have to do that? Why are artists themselves the only ones who have to carry so much of this burden? And so I guess I would sum things up with this sense of ambivalence. The closeness of Japanese artists to everyday life spaces and practices is something that I find really exciting. It's a resource, it's an adventure, but at the same time, we mustn't overlook the precarious exposure artists suffer as a result. In closing, I just want to shift gears a bit, and this is sort of a separate comment, but I did want to try to sneak it in. But I wanted to make a comment on the question of how art responds to crisis. And rather than specific crises, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about historical turning points, particularly the most recent. I feel like we are in or have been living through a historical turning point for the last 20 years, maybe more. Japan before the present day, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, was associated with a blazing economic growth and development. You know, this is Japan of the economic miracle. During that period, many contemporary artists critiqued capitalist development and critiqued the homogenization and massification of Japanese society and culture. Interventionist and critical artists worked to disrupt everyday life, to call attention to its contingency and artificiality. When mainstream culture is so dominant, when the trajectory of growth and development was so clear and shared by so many, critiquing that common sense, that self-assurance, and opening up space for other possibilities was politically significant. Virtually all scholarship on the politics of the avant-gardes of this period relies on some version of an aesthetics of disruption, of critique. But that makes sense, but it assumes a well-defined and clearly dominant mainstream culture against which the small minority of artists position their works, and that's sort of where the political effect comes from. But over the past few decades, it's become clear that growth and development cannot stand in as guarantors of common sense or common value. Environmental catastrophe, low growth economics, demographic decline have all undermined faith in growth, even the idea that growth is good. So new forms of living and understanding are required. Growth is so foundational to the ideology and institutions of modernity that just making policy changes and technical solutions seem unlikely to address the pathologies that have been identified with it. Established political systems have proved unable to think past it. And in that sense, I think a cultural transformation is necessary and may be happening. And it's something that art is particularly attuned to because of the way that art plays with inherited meanings and experiments with new ones. But I think that the relationship of art to the everyday world fundamentally changes in this context. It no longer makes as much sense to critique the mainstream when the mainstream is no longer really there, when there's no clear anchor for common values. So art is more of a brave, maybe a generatively naive attempt to step into the future, but a future that's genuinely unknown, that is not mapped by the trajectory of growth. So I feel that art and the work of artists really have changed over the past 10 to 20 years, just as society itself has changed and has begun to shed the growth ideology that was the heart of modernity. So thank you. Those are my comments. I think they're a bit disjointed, but I'm looking.
No, that's really great, Justin. Thank you so much for that wonderful historical overview as well, which taught me a lot. Right, so now the two from Art for All, Joy Kawakubo and Towa Takaya, are going to do a kind of double act. So over to you, Joy.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Wakabayashi-san and Justin-san, for their very, very insightful presentations. So now we're going to talk, Takaya-san and me, we're going to talk from the point of view of the artists. Art for All, if we could go to this next slide. Yes, it's a little bit very, very tiny letters, so I'm going to take an excerpt from that. But we are a network or a group of loosely interconnected art creators and other people involved in the contemporary arts field who are working to improve the environment for the visual art sector. And these include not only artists, but also installers, art managers, coordinators, photographers, assistant students. So it's kind of like a rough example of the people that are building the whole contemporary art ecosystem, which is quite complex, I guess. And it was formed in 2020, and it was triggered by the COVID pandemic. But there is many of the artist members of Art for All were also participating in the Aichi Triennale that Justin has mentioned, when there was kind of a polemic between the Japanese government trying to cancel it because of political reasons. Well, it didn't say it was political reasons, but for some reasons, and the artists trying to fight for the right for freedom of speech and expression. So I think in that sense, 2020 might have make like a historical point where there was a change of balance, perhaps, and or at least many artists became more aware of the instability that many were in. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, and
yeah. So I am going to briefly introduce our past activities from now on. Like in June 2020, we held a two-day online conference involving a total around 500 people related in visual arts. As a result, Art for All submitted a request for emergency measures for the visual arts to the Cabinet Office and other ministries and departments in Japan. Total number of signatories was 4,710. Please go to next slide. Yes. Throughout the past 2 years, we constantly held practical workshops for artists and art workers, of which various specialists were invited for knowledge sharing. The topics were, for instance, about the financial situation of artists, change of location of activities, with building a professional career, harassment, and about the ways to create a good working environment. Also, corresponding to the aforementioned workshops, a radio program called AFA Radio has been opened up with casual and honest discussion with guests related to each topics. It is available on YouTube and podcasts right now. The most recent topic for both workshops and radio program was notion of care. We considered how artists and art workers can make a good balance between working as a professional being and caring in domestic situations, such as raising children, nursing, or even self-care. Now we Art for All are preparing for the launch of an official website which allows visitors to access more detailed information about our activities, including past archives and relating articles. Please go to next slide. And other past activities were following. Produced a guide for those applying for the Agency for Cultural Affairs, continuing support grants for cultural and artistic activities. Carried out a survey about the Agency for Cultural Affairs, continuing support grant for cultural and artistic activities, which was one of the projects supported by the fiscal 2020 second supplementary budget. Fact-finding research on project founded by continuing support grant for cultural and artistic activities. Carried out a survey about Cultural Affairs Agency overseas training program for up and coming artists. Please go to the next slide. And
yes.
yes.
Thank you. Yes, and briefly taking following Wakabayashi-san and Jesty-san presentations about the current state of the Japanese visual arts ecosystem, I think it's very interesting to retake the point where this situation kind of feel it started. So Justin-san mentioned the 80s as a point where everything changed a little bit. And I think it's something that perhaps from the artist's point of view is something that started globally with the situation where the individuality became one of the mainstreams. There's the very famous words of Margaret Thatcher in 1987, when she said that there is no such a thing as society. There on individual men and women and their families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look to themselves first, which I think is quite a strong statement. And that was linked to economic growth. In the 2000s, the UK shifted a lot in terms of cultural policy, triggering a movement in global other institutions. There is many studies about that, and there is a quote that I will to quickly quote. It says from Claire Bishop's 2012. She says, "New Labour adopted a far more openly instrumental approach to cultural policy than previous British government, and this is extended to intervening in the national curriculum to facilitate the development of creativity within schools as a subject as equal to literacy and numeracy." 2001 Green Paper opens with the words, "Everyone is creative," presenting the government's mission as one that aims to free the collective potential of individuals. This aim of unleashing creativity, however, is not directed towards greater social happiness or the realization of authentic human potential or the imagination of utopian alternatives, but rather, in the words of sociologist Angela McRobbie, and quote, inside quote, "to produce a future generation of socially diverse creative workers who are brimming with ideas and whose skills need not only to be channeled into the field of art and culture, but will also be good for business. Most importantly, these will be self-standing or self-sufficient individuals whose efforts will not be hindered by the administrations of the state," end of quote. So as a result of UK's Cool Britannia campaign and the Dutch approach to the creative industry around the same period in the early 2000s, the economy of the creative industry has grown considerably, and working methods have diversified and individual lifestyles have become more flexible. But following these, many countries, Japan as well, followed the example and began bringing similar cultural policies like the soft power strategies. The Japanese government made the cultural initiative named Cool Japan, a name that sounds suspiciously familiar to many, perhaps. But paradoxically, however, this has led to an increase in the number of freelancers in the creative industry, not only in the creative industry, perhaps, but who have taken on more responsibility for their own lives, accepting more instability in exchange for greater flexibility. And this might have been fine during periods of economic growth, but when the economy went into recession with the financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID pandemic, individuals without backing were the most hard hit, and it became the very big difficulty for these individuals, and artists were part of this, I think. So the questions that would be raised is, what's the actual state of visual art in Japan, and how to create a more striving, vibrant, exciting society through art? Should art be left to the free kind of gig market? And how to create a safer, more secure and sustainable environment for the art sector in general? And I want to hand over to Towa-san again to kind of report the results of a quick survey that we did 2 weeks ago to 100 artists, around 90 to 100 artists, contemporary artists, regarding their life conditions and payment. Yes. So Takaya-san,
Yes,
if you.
thank you. So please go to the next slide. So the reason why we did a questionnaire survey is the visual art is, it's because we consider visual art is extremely important element of culture. Culture has a very strong connection with people's identity, happiness, and quality of life, and a sense of psychological fulfillment. It is risky for society to leave it entirely to the free market and rely on each individual's capabilities and responsibilities without establishing any safety net. So I am going to share the result of questionnaire. Okay. So in Art for All, there are some groups working for particular issues. One of working groups that aims to establish a general guideline for improving remuneration in the field of visual art. Art for All conducted a questionnaire survey on 90 artists and art workers. So please go to the next slide. The question was, are you currently doing other work as well as your artistic activities? More than 60% of artists are doing other works as well.
Yeah,
So,
and we can see also that there is quite a varied range of other jobs that so it's usually probably like temporary jobs. And that's the reason why it is so varied, I guess.
Please go to the next slide. We asked our survey respondents what percentage of their total income came from art in past 5 years. Around 30% of artists make 70 to 100% of their annual income from fine art, while around 40% make 0 to 25%. In the Agency for Cultural Affairs survey of all practitioners, including other creative fields, 57 responded 75 to 100%, while 90 responded to 0 to 25%. Comparing those figures clearly shows that workers in fine art disproportionately have to do other types of work. Yes.
Yeah, and about the annual income, it's also very interesting that 1 million yen is roughly like, how much would it be? Like 7.
Yeah, something like that, isn't it? £7,000 or something?
Yeah, roughly.
Mm.
So probably the 40% of the artists earns between 1 million and 2 million yen, which is probably between 7,000 to 1,400 or 1,400 pounds, which is quite relatively low, probably. Yeah, maybe shall we go to the next one, perhaps?
So about 75% of respondents have experienced injury or illness through their artwork. And on the next slide, 83.2% of them have paid their own treatment. Finally, we questioned the needs for solidarity among arts professionals. 74.7% of respondents need an organization of solidarity among art professionals. In addition, there were many comments to request for supporting to have contract between art workers, either public institutions nor private galleries.
Mm-hmm. So based on that, I quickly want to go through the mission statement and the aims of Art for All. And it's basically that we try to promote the empowerment of individuals working in the arts sector, improve the operating environment for art workers, and contribute to the realization of a society that in which culture and arts are more fully respected. So next slide, please. Yes, and we have a few core values for our activities. We try to be, we respect to be fair, trying to respect differences, work with moderation, and help each other. So we try to stick to these values ourselves, and also try to ask other organizations and any work environment for art to try to respect these four important values. Next slide, please. And our activities range from the level of individual people to the community layer or to the society as a whole. So, for example, in the individual layer, we try to do webinars for information sharing, groups, meetings to share other kind of information, consulting personal issues or about career. We have a range of artists from 20s to 40s, 50s, but the main, the core members are mostly around 40s, I would say. And then in the community level, it would be about trying to create a guideline for artist fees, trying to set up a way to make insurance for freelance art workers, legal advice, improving the working environment as a whole, and trying to stop and preventing abuse and harassment in the work environment in the arts, which is quite common. Most of the artists are based in Japan, but there are many that are based in other parts of Europe, mainly perhaps France. We have people from France, from the UK, from Ireland as well. And then as a society, towards society, we would like to work towards a raising the budget of for culture and arts of the national, but from the national budget to 1%. It is currently 0.1%. It's lower than the cultural budget of most of the countries of Europe, and also try to reaggregate ourselves to kind of try to function as a pressure group or a union or a lobbying group that could raise questions and concerns from the artist's point of view to other policymakers, governing bodies, etc. And as well, at last, campaigning activities to promote understanding of the value of art and importance of meaning of art in society as a whole. Next slide, please. So, yeah, our activities are as start from, yes, network creating. We also create content with radio programs, or try to make as well webinars that are usually by artists for artists, or by, yes, art related professionals to other professionals. So it's quite, like knowledge sharing, and forming links with other organizations as well. As, yes, I have also explained in the last, in the other slide. And can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, and then bringing back to the whole, yes, talk regarding the art economic, the art ecosystem in Japan. Yes, how can we ensure that visual arts, but not only visual arts, but the arts as a whole it has the necessary support to develop as as an independent entity and not necessarily linked to policy of government, but with independence and with vibrant and exciting outcomes that are important for society and for art as a whole.